Welcome back to the Predictable Revenue Podcast. I'm your host, Colin Stewart. Today, I'm joined by Matt Iovani. He's a partner at Full Funnel, and we are going to talk about why it does or does not make sense to outsource your SDR team. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Super happy to be here.
So if you're listening and you're wondering what the hell is this episode going to be about, I think, Matt, your hypothesis is that, people shouldn't outsource their SDR function. My hypothesis is that they should. There's a time and a place. There's a time and a place where it makes more sense. There's a time and a place when it doesn't. We're going to kind of not battle it out, but we'll share conflicting opinions. And I think it'll be, at the end of the day, an interesting conversation. So I want to open with you. Why do you think people shouldn't open or outsource their SDR function?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. For me, it's not so much that they shouldn't outsource it. It's how you use the tool and whether you indefinitely outsource that function of your business. And I think it's really challenging for a lot of companies to outsource indefinitely this very core function, which is connected to product market fit. It's been my experience that when folks look at outsourcing this outbound motion or that sort of SDR motion, they sort of tend to fall into two camps. There are folks that really know exactly how to sell their product. They have got product market fit nailed. Like Google, as an example, does outsource a fair amount of that sort of outbound motion. Microsoft outsources this. Like these companies outsource that motion, but they have this thing dialed to the nines. They know what they're selling, who they're selling it to. There's good product market fit, so on and so forth. In those instances, organizations trying to outsource that function, it makes a lot of sense for them. They're not trying to add a lot of critical infrastructure. They're big, they're bureaucratic. Them doing anything is like clunky, and it makes sense for them to find like a real value add partner to help them with that distribution. Where I find the big problem with outsourced SDRs is, and Full Funnel doesn't just do outsourced SDR work. We started doing it in 2020, mainly because I was just fascinated how many people were doing it. It took off like a rocket ship. We ended up having a very large staffing business as a result. And for me, the thing I observed is a lot of organizations that were coming in were very small. They were organizations that were like between Series A, Series B, or not even venture funded or anything to that effect. They didn't have product market fit, and they really didn't understand what the market wanted. They just wanted demand. And I think that that's the sort of point where I look at this and I'm like, you guys probably shouldn't be outsourcing this soup to nuts to some other company to figure it out on your behalf. And part of the challenge that I think organizations are running into now is like this idea of what is this SDR function supposed to do? And at some level, I try to break it down to like you're paying for distribution, like a demand gen program. You have peer-to-peer channels like your word of mouth, networking, referrals, events, trade shows, partners, things like that. Then you have earned media, so organic traffic or organic social, things of that nature. You have paid advertising, search, social, programmatic, directory, display, etc. Then you end up with outbound. And outbound is email, phone, social, occasionally text. But really what you're doing is you're using people and this activity as a distribution medium to take a value narrative, put it in front of someone who is not expecting to be contacted, and trying to elicit a favorable response or generate interest. And so if you start thinking of the failure points there, and this is where I think outsourced SDR companies actually add a ton of value, is like most businesses struggle with the operationalizing of that function, right? How to recruit, hire, train, build redundancy, ramp, how to do the training and professional development. But the reality is that a lot of these interactions, like if you're doing outsourced SDRs the right way, which is that it's fully transparent with the client, you're usually working inside of their infrastructure, or they have full visibility into your infrastructure. You're starting to really focus on what happens at the interaction between the message you're distributing and the prospect that is absorbing it. And it's like if you tell 10 people that you theoretically are selling to something and they're not interested, that's a data point. You tell that to 100 people and they're not interested, that's a trend and you got a problem. And I think that most organizations don't look at it like that. They're sort of like pass fail. You guys either know what you're doing, you're going to get us meetings and everything's going to be gravy, or conversely, you guys are terrible, you don't know what you're doing because no one is interested in my product. That is a really inefficient way of using organizations that, in my experience, whether it's predictable revenue or full funnel or junk crew or revenue or any of these companies, most of these companies are incredibly proficient operationally at getting this motion going.
Totally. It's not just about the operational, it's the strategy. And it does kind of feel like with a client, it's the roll of the dice of like, what is the first market that they get us to go after? We put so much effort and work into our market fit, like onboarding program to help kind of dissect. And really it's to help get the client out of their own way and be like, just give us who is the most likely to respond right now, and not like, let's test out an obscure market that you want to start with. Because my least favorite engagement is when somebody comes in and says, hey, we want to test out a new market. And then 4 months later, they're like, yeah, we're going to fire you because we didn't get any meetings. They're like, well, yeah, test out a new market. Like, we did the thing. They're like, yeah, but we didn't get any revenue from it. And it's like, but you've never gotten any revenue from it. I had a client where we did exactly this. We spent 6 months. We booked them like 60 something meetings. And at the end of the engagement, I was grilling the AE because I knew the CEO was grilling the AE, like, what went wrong? And he finally blurted out after 30 minutes of me like hammering him. He's like, oh, we've never actually closed a meeting, or we've never closed a deal in this vertical before. The founder just wanted to explore this. And I was like, I'm going to punch you. I mean, I think what people actually buy when they're buying outsourcing is you're buying a combination of the strategy, the management, and the labor. But the way people see what they are buying is they just see, oh, I'm buying an SDR. Yeah. I'm renting an SDR. And any SDR worth their salt, you guys are the experts here. Any SDR worth their salt should be able to go and book meetings because I can book meetings for myself and I've got a 40% close rate. But when you people, and I think there's a couple of things, is one, people don't want to pay for the strategy work that they need. And that's one of the biggest pieces, is they don't understand that there's you got to give people direction. You have to tell people, this is how you build those accounts, that if I book 60 meetings for you, you're going to fucking close some of them, And the second piece is when somebody says, oh, I piss excellence, I've got a 40% close rate, all I need is more meetings on my calendar. The thing that I struggle with is a lot of these AEs don't understand what it's like to take a real cold outbound meeting.
Yes.
We help a lot of companies with adding their first growth channel, beyond founder network, word of mouth, referral, a little bit of inbound. And there's a dramatic difference between somebody who's in your founder's network, who is basically ready to buy. There's the social proof, there's everything, there's a relationship, there's trust. Then you go outside and into the cold. And as a salesperson, you really got to work for these deals. And I find a lot of AEs that I coach or work with or encounter, they're not prepared. And they're like, oh, these meetings suck. You're like, well, yeah, of course they do, compared to your boss's buddy who they go back, 20 years. Of course it's going to be harder.
I always try to think about this. For me, it's really, it is amusing, especially, and I'm sure you're here too, because we've both been doing this a very long time. And for me, this has been a decade of doing this. So, before I did this, I was a salesperson, I was a business development person. I did all of these roles. And one of the things that's really interesting is we have, as a sort of business community, especially in B2B software and some of these other sort of verticals, we've gotten ourselves into this problem, because the way that most organizations are going to run their sort of professional development food chain is you come in as an SDR, and then if you're really good and proficient, we want to move you out of that role as soon as humanly possible into the coveted role of being an account executive. When the velvet ropes part, you get your Patagonia vest, and then you get to stop doing all this terrible stuff that you have to do when you're a janitor. The problem is that what companies are doing is essentially just loading up that pipeline management layer with people who are underutilized, and they've really never had to go to battle. To your point, they've gotten leads that are so warm or so easy that they're order taking. It's an administrative function. When someone says I close at a 50% rate, I almost always think that you're full of shit. And the reason is because I don't close at a 50% rate. but I primarily deal with cold prospects, people who come in to our organization through word of mouth or advertising or outbound or whatever it might be. And I got to convince them that we are a good fit through what is effectively consultative selling. So if I'm not doing that, I'm going to have a hard time believing that you're doing that as like a product engineering background or something at a company. It just doesn't make sense.
And so there might be problem aware. They might not be problem aware. They might have, and like, if you're lucky, you might come across somebody who is aware of the problem and has decided to do something about it. If you're lucky.
Yeah. I mean, well, look at it like this. I mean, a lot of folks, and just kind of building off of that, like a lot of folks are like, well, what's my ROI going to be on this program? And for me, I'm always like, well, what kind of ROI are you looking for? Right? Because like there is a reality too that question is illogical. Right? You know, if you're a VC funded startup and you're looking to acquire net new logos for 200% of ACV, it's going to be a lot different than a pro serve firm looking to acquire clients at like 10% of total revenue. Right? And so there is this narrative that like an ROI is based on your financial framework of reasonable returns, which is vastly different depending on what kind of company you are, what you're trying to do, where you are in the market cycle. You know, the thing that I always try to look at is like, look, I am of the opinion that you should be able to close 1 out of 5 BANT qualified or whatever qualifications there that you want to use deals. I still maintain that BANT's the best one. Come at me, Medic and MedPick. But like the reality is like, I'm a very simple guy. And so for me, if you have 5 BANT qualified ops and you can close 1 of them, good. You're like cooking with gas. So for me, if like you need to get like a 3-to-1 return on invested capital on your total program, then you have to be like, okay, well, 3-to-1 return and I close at a 20% rate. So I'm going to need a 15x per dollar invested on pipeline. And so the way that I would look at the health of the program is predicated on pipeline growth, not on return on investment. And to your point, that completely eradicates the whole aspect of like, I have a 6-month sales cycle. I'm 3 months in. Where's my money? Because you're looking at the right metric. It also solves the problem where you sort of have all this pipeline that then doesn't close. Because it's like the issue isn't the pipeline rate, it's the close rate. If you're only closing 5% of deals, you know, and you want a 3-to-1, well, guess what? It's not a 15x on pipeline. You're going to need like a very substantial amount of pipeline. And so I just find that like, what's weird about this market after doing this for 10 years is like, you kind of look at people and you're like, all right, you're a smart guy. You're a CEO, you know, CFO, CRO, but you're saying things that make no sense. And if you break it on a chalkboard, you can't even make it make sense. But the reality is they'll just look at you dead in the eye and they're just like, make my problem go away. And I get that. I don't fault them for that. It's just that, you know, I really want to win the lottery. Like it would be great. Like I really would love to get $1 billion check right now. I'd take half of it, let the other half go, and just I'd be done. Unfortunately, I have to work every day because I got to feed myself. And so, you know, you can play that game all you want, but eventually it is going to come back to like, you got to put the work in. You actually have to have like a, you know, financially productive exercise. And so to tie it back where I think that, you know, the SDR function should live is that I honestly believe that most of these SDR outsourcing organizations do a bang up job for the most part. There's some that certainly don't, but like all the good ones, they do a great job operationalizing this stuff. But the reality is they cannot fix a lack of product market fit or executive understanding of that motion. You can't do that. And for me, like maybe at 5 clients, you could do that. At 25, getting harder. 50, way harder. At 100,
it's impossible.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
So I really feel like the way that people should utilize these types of organizations and how I espouse people should use ours is like, let us set this function up. Like, let's get it rolling for you, but you got to own this function because you got to take accountability that this is your problem, which is always that product market fit, like market absorption problem. I don't disagree with you. The strategy layer of like how we can help clients rationalize this is critically important. But I don't think that this sort of like indefinite outsourced team makes sense. I just don't. I haven't seen it work. Because for me, the problem that exists right at this very moment, once it's like productive, is like, where does this go from here? Because to your point, like, we cannot facilitate the same level of intersection, interoperability, whatever that might be, with you being in-house. The other thing is you're paying a premium for us to be managing this labor. And once people are productive, they're hitting their goals and objectives, it's kind of like mission accomplished. From that point forward, usually people are trying to scale it or do something else around that, where I think organizations like ours like offer a lot of value. I think what ends up getting missed in this like SDR conversation, I think like for any of those companies, especially like you and I have been doing this for a very long time. So I meet people who've been doing this for like less than 3 years, doing like outsourced staffing or something. I'm always like, listen, like, let me try to help you with this, which is that it doesn't work if you try to just keep like your clients albatrossed with your labor. It does not work. It's bad for the rep. It's bad for the client. It's actually bad for you. You just don't realize it yet. And because of all of that, like that model needs to shift. And one of the things and you know, back when I met you originally, like we had some really cool conversations and I left being like, wow, this guy actually like doesn't look at this as just like a body shop organization. He looks at it like there's a lot going on here that I want to engineer. The best thing that our sort of market can do is sort of like what is effectively outsourced sales providers in some sense is start moving towards like demand engineering. Like stop thinking about it as a body shop or a one person or per head basis. Like that is a thing. But the way that we add durable value in the market, what I believe is that I have gone through probably like, God, like just since 2020, probably like 1,500 SDRs that I've like had on staff and what have you. Like I meet VPs of sales like, well, I just completed a Series A and I've had 30 people work on me. I'm like, I've had 1,500 of these people, right? You learn stuff. And the reality is that like what I've learned is that like this collective of who we are, this type of organization, like we're really good at getting this up and running. And to your point, if you don't have like the need for 2 SDRs, you're not going to put all this infrastructure in place. But we're not a substitute for you, the company, figuring out how to flip and sell your product. We're just not.
Yes.
Even like winning by design that has nothing to do with this, or SBI growth, like they don't do that. They give you some guardrails on what to do, but like at some point, you, the company, you, the CEO, like you need to be able to sell your product. We can help you operationalize it. We can minimize risk during it. But like we're not a panacea to take crappy products into the market. The market for SDRs are also like killing this whole thing, right? I can't tell you the amount of people that I'll talk to that be like, well, how many dials an hour do you guys make? And it's like, what do you mean? Well, how many dials an hour do you make? I'm like, you know that's a stupid question, right? Like the reality is if you have a 1% connect rate, you're going to make a lot of dials. If you got a 20% connect rate, like a 2.5 minute average talk time, you're going to make a lot less dials. Using manual dialing on a rotary phone? Are you quick calling through a Sales Pro or a Sales Loft? Do you use Orem or Salesfinity? Are you using a Connect and Sell? Like, it is not a linear thing. And like, I don't know why this particular function in sales, people try to commoditize down to like numbers, but it's like, it's lunacy. You know, it's always been when you're paying someone, especially on phone, to do this work, you're paying for them to interact with a prospect. I am more concerned with talk time. What is the total amount of time that you are talking to prospects and how many of them were you talking to? And then I want to know qualitatively through recordings and otherwise what happened in those interactions. It's mental that we like, well, these other companies, they do 40 dials an hour. It's like, who cares?
Yeah. I 100% agree. It's not about the dials per hour. It's not about the calls. Because, I mean, with tools like Orem and Connect and Sell, I could dial 1,000 calls an hour. They're not going to be super high quality. You're going to get a ton of hangups. So it's not about the metrics. It's about the output. It's about the results. The thing that I think a lot of people, they mistake is they build their math of like, is this going to be ROI positive off of like a proof of concept or like early proof of concept numbers. The way I look at like an engagement of like going from 0 to 1, and I'd love your thoughts on this, you know, with the new SDR team or whether you're outsourcing it or insourcing it, there's this like prove it stage. Prove that I can get something interesting. I don't fucking care what the metrics say. Just prove that I can get something interesting. I want to see, I'm going to turn the batteries on. I'm going to see if this car like turns over, right? Can I get it to turn over? I'm not going racing yet. I just want the engine to turn over. Great. That takes 4 to 6 months. If I get something interesting, and that should be like meetings, obviously, probably some pipeline, maybe a closed deal. But if I can get something interesting to happen, I'm leaving the like prove it stage, prove that it works, prove that it's alive. I'm moving to the optimize stage. And then that's where you're spending all this time. Okay, how do we make this better? We've got something that works. What are the things that we need to do to operationalize to make it better? And then once you get through there, you scale. It's like, cool, we've hit this. Now we're going to double down until we start to see diminishing returns. I think shops are really great for the first 2 phases. And to your point, you're not going to be able to hit you'll be able to hit a better level of scale internally than you will with an external rep or with an external service, because you have to pay my markup on all the things. So you'll be, X% more expensive than everybody else.
They're also misaligned incentives, right? So I will just to hit that last point, like the way that most SDRs as a service companies make money is based on the person being billed out. And so whether that's fractionally or holistically, FTEs or partially, you're incentivized as an SDR company to keep those people working and billing. Any sort of deterioration of that is bad. To your point, like the way that the market should shift, and in fairness, like most of the really good players in this space already have this product distinction, is that you do have the sort of test sort of product, which is like test this motion, make sure it works. Then you have like a scale this motion, where you start to like put fully dedicated people on it. You start going through that motion. And then you have this, like you either take it internally or you scale to a point where it's not just like a price per head, because you can't, people ask me all the time, like, well, what happens? Like, is there a price break at, 5 or 10 people? I'm like, oh no, it actually goes up. Of course it goes up. What are you kidding me? Like you have 1 dog that you're walking. It's not a big deal. 2 dogs you're walking. Not a big deal. 15 dogs you're walking. Oh, now it's starting to become a big deal. 30, 40, 50. Like there's infrastructure required as these things expand. And so what I've found and why I really like the idea of getting this in their company, clients' company, because it starts showing them the actual requirement to manage this type of function. It gives them perspective on it. Bigger organizations like your Adobe's, your Microsoft, like they will pay companies like ours plenty of money to set up that infrastructure and not be concerned about it. The issue is when like the smaller companies that we start getting it moving, they're like, great, let's move to 10 or 15 reps. It's like, okay, let's talk about how that works. And they're like, wait a minute, wouldn't the price go down? Like, no, what are you, crazy? It just doesn't make sense. But again, it's them looking at this as a completely transitory, transactional thing that's like easy, like it's a call center. It's not
an external thing I don't have to think about. And like, if you're going to be spending that amount of money, I think it's crazy to want to have 10 or 20 or 30 outsource reps. Like at that scale, you can, once you hit 7, even at 4 or 5 reps, if you're a company that has the budget for 4 or 5 outsource reps, you absolutely have the budget to bring this internally and get a pretty good ROI on, the right people you need to build that team.
This is a time when I think all of the folks that offer these services, it's a cool opportunity to start moving this in a direction that I think is more like aligned with where the market's going to go. And the only way to do that is by educating, I think, like what is effectively this net new class of CMO, CRO. And I think they're feeling that, because I talk to these folks, and I'm sure you do as well, where they're like, yeah, I'm struggling. There's too much tech here. The best is like the VP of sales who just took over a program. They're like, I don't even know what I'm looking at. Like this HubSpot is here. I use Salesforce. This thing doesn't even work. Like, how to use this? What is Apollo? Like, what is that? There's that problem is pretty pervasive right now.
Well, and then you get into like, oh, and you want to do any of the cool stuff with AI, you got to use Clay. And people are like, oh, let me see Clay. And they're like, oh, cool. It looks like a database. And you're like, well, kind of. Like it is, but that's like the Crayola crayon version of what Clay is. It can be the most magnificent fountain pen, but there's a lot of skill that goes into writing with a fountain pen that I do not possess, but I can write with crayons. Yeah,
Clay is like a fascinating thing. I mean, I think Clay is like the big leverage point for where this is going. And like, I know those guys, I don't. That platform and product, as I look at it, I'm like, I'm like, this is great. This is super cool. And it finally is like where demand is going, which is it's demand engineering. It's not just like repetitive motion of dialing or what have you. The cool thing about where that is heading, though, is like, to your point, you can't just hire a 24-year-old kid and be like, here's Clay, good luck. That just is not how it's going to work. You also can't give Clay to like the 50-year-old person who worked at Oracle for 20 years and did things one way, and like that's not going to work. So the space now for like demand engineering, I think is huge. And I think that those platforms, let's face it, like whether it's like HubSpot or SalesLoft, they're all coming for that. Like it's going to be like the Clay thing versus like these other things. And, you know, I feel like it's going to be a really cool next couple of years, but there is this reality that we're now moving away from the sort of archaic SDR model. And it's going to be interesting to see where this goes. And I think that the organizations like, you know, yours, like mine, like these other companies are going to have to adapt. And it's going to be fascinating to see which ones do and which ones try to retain that like 2020 model, which, I mean, I've seen people that are still like, we're not going out of business now. There's people actually going out of business doing this because that model doesn't work anymore.
And they're going down with the sink and ship and they're saying, oh, SDR doesn't work. SDR doesn't work.
Yeah.
I had a conversation just before this call with somebody who's like, yeah, cold email doesn't work. And I was like, oh, interesting. Tell me what you did. They're like, oh, we sent, you know, thousands and this and that. I went into MX Toolbox and I did a lookup. I was like, you don't have a DKIM record set up and you've got a 308 redirect as a domain. I was like, these are two things that are going to absolutely murder your email deliverability. So your email campaigns weren't even a fair test because you probably didn't even send it because so much of this was probably in just quarantine or spam or lost. And so to your point, like the old model doesn't work. Table stakes, as sales development still works, cold calling still works, cold email still works, but the table stakes have risen. And if you're not doing things like Orem or using things like Clay, it's a lot harder just to like hit just like the bare minimum. You know, and I think a lot of companies missed out on that and they didn't have the technical capabilities. And it's much easier to say, oh, sales development doesn't work than it is to admit that I didn't have the skills or the ability to figure out how to make it work with this next coming of.
Yeah,
you know, totally. Well, and I think there's a funnel that's missing, which is there's a conflict between sales and marketing. We're sales at demand gen where marketing says, hey, this is the right person at the right account and they want to chat. And sales goes, yeah, but they don't want to do anything in the next 90 days. You know, they're aware of the problem, but they don't want to buy right now. That conversation in most organizations I deal with, that prospect dies in your CRM.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody's going to follow up on that. It's hard. It's a low to medium value. It's more value than following up and nurturing a cold contact, but it's less value than working an inbound lead. And it's also, there's a high volume. There's a lot of them that you need to do. It takes a lot of remembering to get all this on track. And so what happens is two things. They either live in your reps pipeline and suddenly you have 386 deals in your AE's pipeline and you're like, there's
terrible.
10% of these are real. Or they lost them and they die there. And or they reject them as leads. They're like, no, it's not a good fit. And they stay on the marketing side and they die as a lead that nobody ever follows up with again.
Right.
And like, I think they're the way that we measure and organize these teams, we're missing this fourth funnel, which is this nurture category of our reps have had a conversation with them, but they're not ready to buy yet. And I think if you are working this nurture funnel appropriately, what we've seen is that at the 6-month mark of a sales development program, the nurture funnel comes online and the nurture funnel is producing a deal every month or a deal every other month, depending on how much you're working on it. Like I've seen it double the results of an SDR when done effectively. And so like, how do you when you get to that, like scale it or optimize it stage, so many companies are leaving money on the table because they're just ignoring this fourth funnel that marketing says is good, that sales says is not good. And there's this conflict that nobody wants it. So it just dies in the CRM. Well, my takeaway is if I want to understand what demand gen is going to look like in the future, I got to go back to Jim Morrison, take a bunch of psychedelics, and that's it. You heard it here first, Matt.
That sounds amazing. Oh, man.
Matt, thanks so much for coming on the show. This was really fun.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Colin. Really appreciate it.